Thank you very much. This is not the speech. I just happened to bring this along. I thought you'd be interested. That's the result of this year's budget. That's from origin to first House version to second Senate version to final conference committee. But I won't spend that much time talking. I want to, first of all, thank Public Policy Foundation for this invitation, the Tax Foundation. Public Policy Foundation does an excellent job in raising issues to the visibility level where they are dealt with, which we have lacked in this state for some time. And probably one of the most important things we haven't done in a long, long time is really taking a good whole look at the whole aspect of spending and the whole aspect of taxing. Now, I realize my subject is spending, and I realize I'm only supposed to make a one-word speech. The question from the Wall Street Journal was, is state spending out of control? Give a one-word answer. The answer to that is maybe. If you listen to your original speakers, and I heard the last of it, it would say, well, compared to every other state, we're not out of control. Well, statistics are statistics, and you can always find a comparison that says you are or aren't whatever you don't want to be or want to be. I think the practical matter is you have to understand what it is that controls your spending and then make a judgment if your spending is out of control. If you look at the last 4 years in this state, I think the statement made by the preceding speakers is probably more correct than not correct. But necessity is the mother of invention. When Governor Miller was elected and went into office, he went into office simultaneously with the results of an economic downturn. In Georgia, we do not deficit spend. So the very first budget that was put into place was a budget because we cut because we had to. Remember, what controls spending oftentimes results in whether or not spending is out of control. And when revenues are down, it is not going to be out of control. And if you look at the past 4 budgets, excepting the last one, you can truthfully say that because of necessity, being the mother of invention, we finally got a hold on supplemental spending because there wasn't much. What spending we did do after Georgia rebound was on necessities, and with some arguable exceptions, which I will attempt to mention briefly, it wasn't. But you have to look at the decade ahead to understand the problem. In the decade ahead, Georgia's spending was vastly out of control. And it's because we were a rapidly growing state. We had the luxury of tremendous growth revenues, and that is going to happen again. And once our control mechanism, which is simply our revenue stream, again is generating greater numbers, the lack of discipline and the lack of priorities and the lack of looking at continuation will ensure that we will make some mistakes. Someone showed me as I walked in my policy statement when I ran for governor in 1990 over what ought to be done on the budget. It was a 9-point plan. It was pretty good. I read it over again. It's not bad. Hadn't changed a whole lot. Now, to the credit of the current administration, the supplemental budget, which was out of control in the last decade, the decade of 80s to 90s, has been under control because there hasn't been much of one, but next year there will be. And I project good growth, and I project some early warning signs for us to be sure and do the right thing. I'll take 5 recommendations I have. I'll make 2 or 3 points, and then I'll sit down and let the more knowledgeable people speak. I have 5 recommendations which I think are absolutely essential given the current control that we have in this state. Number 1 is that we should create a trust out of what has been the supplemental budget. With the exception of funding a midterm adjustment for education and emergencies that exist at the time of the mid-year adjustment, we should just get out of the practice of supplemental spending altogether. Now, this is not a new idea. In fact, in 1984, Senator Paul Coverdell, then a Georgia state senator, and myself as minority leader, during the year in which the movie E.T. won the Academy Award, or won a lot of awards, we proposed, because we had a huge supplemental budget, the creation of E.T., an educational trust for Georgia. Interestingly enough, I did some calculations the other night. Had the supplemental excess funds that existed during that part of the decade from 1984 to 1990, in fact gone into an educational trust instead of being spent on projects or being the seed for future continuation funds, there would not have had to be a $732 million tax increase in 1989 by the raising of the sales tax. Now, somebody could arguably say, yeah, but we wouldn't have done all these good things. The problem when you've got budgets this big, I can find as many bad things as you can find good things. The problem is it is the control mechanism that is important, and I think the supplemental budget process has been something that has been in the past, primarily in the 80s, manipulated to our ultimate detriment. Second, I think we need to eliminate continuation as a mentality in the budget process. In Georgia, and there was a statement made from the audience before, we don't argue. This year, when we debated the FY96 budget, we did not argue about $10,714,000,000. That's the appropriation. We argued about $453 million, which was the excess over the preceding budget. We argued over 4.4% of what we spent. We did not argue over 95.6% of what we spent. Granted, a lot of that's personal services. Granted, it's school teachers. Granted, it's state employees. Granted, it's judges. Granted, it's all those things, but we still don't look at it. My favorite story in the legislature is the first vote I cast as a freshman in 1977 was a vote to repeal the law that said, before entering the city limits of the city of Atlanta in a motorized vehicle, you shall blink your lights and honk your horn 3 times. In 1977, that was on the books. Now, can you picture I-75 at 7 o'clock in the morning with everyone obeying that law? Well, of course not. But Greg Pilowitz, a representative long since left the legislature from DeKalb County, wanted to find something to introduce in his freshman year to pass something, and he found that law and said, this is ridiculous, we don't need it anymore. Well, I would say that the continuation process, the same analogy takes place. No business that's still in business in the last 4 years is in business because it spent what it was spending in 1990 the same way and on the same things. And so we absolutely have to eliminate the continuation mentality. Third, we need to privatize where appropriate. And fourth, we need to fund where funds raised by the use are applicable. And I know I'm probably taking too much time already, but I'd like to use a couple of examples if I can. In the bond program in the supplemental budget this year, we appropriate $173.8 million in new bonds. That only cost us $33 million in appropriation because when you borrow, you only have to appropriate the monthly payments or the annual payments. You don't have to appropriate the lump sum. We came back and appropriated $535 million 4 weeks later in the FY96 budget. So in the course of a month, we appropriated $720 million in debt, for which we appropriated some $85 million in debt service. So we only spent $85 million, but we borrowed almost $800 million. Of that money we borrowed, $195 million was 20-year bonds for roads. I submit to you that when you pay for 20 years on asphalt that will not last longer than 10 to 12, you're making an inappropriate decision. And secondly, when the use of those roads are by drivers that are live in this state as well as many who are going to Florida or going to Tennessee or going to South Carolina or going to Alabama or coming out of our ports, it is time we took a good sense look at our user fees on the use of our roads in terms of motor fuel tax and got out of borrowing on my children. My oldest son's almost 25. We'll pay, when he's 45, we'll pay off the road improvements we're going to make from this $195 million. I would submit to you there is not 1 ounce of that asphalt that when he's 45 years old will exist without being covered up, ground up, or disappeared. That's not a good way to borrow. So wherever we can appropriately raise the funds based on use and not bond for it, we should. Back to one point I want to make on the supplemental budget about creating the trust. I think it's ironic, if you study the lottery in this state, that we are doing with the lottery probably what we should do with the entire state budget. In the lottery, we have a separate law that says exactly what lottery funds will be spent on. They'll be spent on pre-kindergarten, they'll be spent on Hope scholarships, and they'll be spent on technology and capital improvements. That's it. Can't spend them on anything else. And we created a surplus or a reserve fund because the lottery has unpredictable revenues. And we want to make sure that if we promise Hope scholarships, if we promise 4-year-old pre-kindergarten, and if we promise technology grants, and we have a shortfall, we don't think the people ought to suffer. Well, don't tax revenues, aren't they somewhat unpredictable? Didn't they somewhat go down in 1991 when we had the crisis? Yet, except for a 3% shortfall reserve, which at the end of every incumbent governor's term when they leave office is empty, and I've served under 3 of them. The current governor hasn't done it yet. I don't blame him, and he's done some good things. But George Busby, a fine man and a good friend, and Joe Frank Harris, a fine man and a good friend. Busby left under somewhat excellent times. Joe Frank left right at the tail end of the boom, but there was not a drop in the reserve fund. Why? Because as you're going out, you want to leave your legacies, whatever they are, or plant your seeds for continuation, which become a lifelong commitment. So I would submit to you, if it's so good to have a trust fund for the unpredictability of lottery funds being raised in this state, to ensure that we can do what we promised with the lottery, why is it wrong to eliminate supplemental spending except for the midterm adjustment for education and emergencies, and let that other money accrue for a reserve so we don't have to have $732 million increases in the last minute in one session, all because revenues start to go down? Ms. Schenkel's a fine lady, and a lady a lot smarter than I am about the economy, but she hit the nail on the head when she made the statement. I didn't hear it, but I heard the question thrown back to her about, well, you know, if you got to do these things, if things go down, you got to raise taxes. Well, that is because that is the mentality that we have today, that everything we're spending is right, and if revenues go down, we ought to raise taxes. I would submit to you that if I lose my job, I've made some savings to plan for that period of time it's going to take to get the next one. I would submit to you that the average person at least thinks about that because they don't have the alternative of raising their salary or raising money from somebody else. And I would submit to you that if you put in that discipline, not planting the seeds in the supplemental, ending the mentality of continuation, looking for revenues to flow from use wherever possible, privatizing when you can, you will put in the appropriate governors that will be necessary to ensure that your spending won't get out of control, but because your controls are appropriate for the responsibility that you have. Thank you.